This week on Security and Compliance Weekly, we are joined by Mr. Josh Corman. Josh has previously served as CSO for PTC, the director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative for the Atlantic Council, the CTO for Sonatype, director of Security Intelligence for Akamai, and many other senior research analyst and strategy roles. He's currently unemployed, by the way. He's also founder of an organization called I Am the Cavalry, which is helping to develop new security approaches in response to the world's increasing dependence on digital infrastructure. That was a big mouthful. Josh and I were introduced probably 4 or 5 years ago at a hacker security conference by a mutual friend of ours who snickered and said, "You guys ought to talk PCI." We've been avoiding it ever since, or just haven't had the opportunity, but today's the day. Here we are. We are going to talk the good, the bad, the ugly about PCI in our first segment. And in the second segment, we're going to talk a little bit about what Josh is involved with, especially with the Cavalry and other things like that. So join us as we continue our journey of tearing down silos and building bridges on Security and Compliance Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. And now, it's the show that bridges the requirements of regulations, compliance, and privacy with those of security. Your trusted source for complying with various mandates, building effective programs, and current compliance news. It's time for Security and Compliance Weekly. RSA offers business-driven security solutions that provide organizations with a unified approach to managing digital risk that hinges on integrated visibility, automated insights, and coordinated actions. RSA solutions are designed to effectively detect and respond to advanced attacks, manage user access control, and reduce business risk, fraud, and cybercrime. RSA protects millions of users around the world and helps more than 90% of the Fortune 500 companies thrive and continuously adapt to transformational change. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/RSA Security.
Welcome to episode 30 of Security and Compliance Weekly. We are recording live streaming on June 2nd, 2020. I'm your host, Mr. Jeff Mann, and joining me today are my illustrious co-hosts, Mr. Scott Lyons, Mr. Josh Marpet, and Mr. Matt Alderman. Gentlemen, welcome.
Your term is way better than the one I used for these two yahoos.
Oh, come on. We're at episode 30. You've been dealing with us now for what, months?
Yes,
come
that's
on.
True.
Yahoo's
join with me today are my Yahoo
at this
friends.
point. There you go. I'm at least a hooligan by this point, not a Yahoo anymore. Okay, come on.
In a general announcement, for the duration of this show, we are going to refer to our host, Josh, as Marpet, Muppet, Bald Guy, something like that, to distinguish from Josh Corman, who we'll call Bearded One, Fuzzy One, Hairy One, or just Corman. It's just a general announcement. We'll try to all keep up with that, but who knows what's going to come out of our mouths at any given time. Couple quick announcements before we jump into our interview today. Please join us at InfoSec World 2020, which is going to be on June 22nd through 24th, and it's, of course, now a fully virtual event. Security Weekly listeners can save 15% off the InfoSec World Main Conference or World Pass. You get the discount by going to securityweekly.com/ISW 2020. Click the registration button, fill out the information, get the discount code. Also, please join our Security Weekly mailing list, since you're at our site anyway, signing up for InfoSec World. Do this and you'll receive an invite to our community Discord server, which you can get there by going to securityweekly.com/subscribe and clicking the button to join the list. And we are on the Discord server right now, so please come and join us in the discussion and back talking, as old people like me try to keep track of multiple screens.
Right.
Anyway,
And there's 103 online and 512 total in the channel, so join your colleagues.
Come one, come all. Join the fun. All right, so Josh Corman, thank you for being with us today. We've been putting off this conversation for quite a long time. So welcome, Josh, Mr. Corman. Mr. Bearded Fuzzy One?
Bearded fuzzy one? I think we both qualify
Say
for
something.
that, to be honest.
It depends on what part of the head you're looking at, I guess.
I only agreed to talk about PCI because I was told you're going to send me some really good small batch bourbon to lick my wounds with.
Well, let's see how it goes. It'll determine what kind of bourbon you get in the mail. How's that? So I didn't really know the backstory on Josh and all his strong feelings about PCI until we did our prep call a week ago. And, we don't have time to go into all the details, but suffice it to say that for over a decade, Josh has been poo-pooing the idea of PCI for various reasons. And our mutual friend who introduced us, who knows that I love to go on and on about all the great things of PCI, I think was, essentially setting both of us up for an interesting discourse. And we can decide later on if we want to name names. But Josh, we like to start our shows by talking, at least asking an initial question of our guests, and this will probably come out in the conversation that ensues. But just right off the bat, where do you kind of fall on what we call the continuum of security versus compliance? Open-ended question. Feel free to answer how you see fit.
Okay. I think if you aim for compliance, you miss. I think compliance should be the byproduct of well-managed risk. A lot of my criticisms, I think we'll get into PCI, was as people were trying to learn the art of risk management and getting somewhat good at it. A few people were. I think many people got distracted with mandatory compliance spend, and everything else was discretionary, and a lot of the better and more innovative and more fit for purpose investments were in the discretionary category. So, and in fact, even since then, I know Paul and I have talked about this through Gene Kim's work and DevOps and things. I'm starting to think like security and defensibility is the byproduct of well-designed and well-managed IT and software. So I want the focal point to be on the patterns that drive defensible, maintainable, resilient, trustworthy technology. And if our focus is on trailing indicators and the wrong things and brittle specific controls from the past, it's going to be at the opportunity cost and neglect of dynamic, adaptive future investments that we're going to need as the world changes. So I'm not a fan of compliance for compliance sake. I think many of the right things you should be doing for IT and risk management should be able to demonstrate compliance for free, and harmonizing those is the art form.
That's the best answer I've heard in 30 episodes, because you went right to you went to the heart of it, Josh, which was risk management. This is security and compliance play in this broader thing of risk management. And, you brought it in right away to say, look, if you're managing risk, you're going to do the right things from a security perspective, and you're going to get compliance kind of for free as an outcome, which is kind of the way I think about it. So I do enjoy the risk management component that you brought in, because I think that's one of the things in PCI that's kind of missing a little bit. There isn't really a risk assessment or a risk discussion. It's like, here's 12 sections of a standard, go, without any thought about, does it apply or doesn't it apply? Do I see that as a risk or not a risk? It's like all or none.
Well, that's
now
not exactly.
I know you say that every time, Jeff, but the way a lot of people read PCI is it's all or
no,
none.
and I acknowledge that. Well, let me frame it and acknowledge what you're saying, and put it back then on Josh for comment. There is a requirement within PCI that says, and I'm paraphrasing, everything that you do in terms of security practices and procedures and technology implementations and monitoring them and responding to incidents, the whole litany, make sure that all rolls up into an annual risk assessment. Where I agree with you that it falls down is that it's not emphasized as being sort of the critical starting point for your entire operation. It's put at the end of PCI. It's in requirement 12. So a lot of people, by the time they get the 12, they're just like, what do I have to fill out to get it done? Because they've been through the ringer of all the technical controls and so on and so forth.
Control fatigue.
But to the degree that it's in there, yes. Is it emphasized? No. But what I heard Josh say, and what I'm interested in getting his take on is, or Matt or anybody, is the responsibility then for security, or specifically, Josh, you made it sound like it's the responsibility of IT. So in the form of a question, is it really? Or where does the responsibility for risk fall? Where does the responsibility then for security and compliance, in whatever form that takes, fall or should fall within an organization?
Well, there's a lot of things packed in there. So one thing Jeff and I...
You're welcome.
I'll pivot into your answer. One thing Jeff and I discussed, because I had no interest in rehashing stuff that I kind of put to bed in 2010 and 2011. So I was reluctant to do this rehash unless it leads to something productive. So I promised I'd try to explain the apparent contradictions between me hating PCI regulations from 2010, 2009, and where they stood there, to yes, he's right. There have been some adjustments and improvements and softenings, not as far as any of us would like, but I wanted to pivot to what are the attributes of good incentives and regulations versus bad ones, so that we have a lens with which to see the things that, are happening with IoT or with FDA medical devices or with software transparency, because I am now advocating for those. And in the second segment, I think we'll tease out some of those attributes. But Jeff promised not to be an apologist for PCI, at every turn. And I promised to grant the positive aspects of regulation and compliance, to be fair about it. But as far as that responsibility, the cliche answer isn't far from the truth, which is kind of security is everybody's responsibility. The RSA conference had me do a Pecha Kucha talk or Pachachka talk, one of those 20 slides that auto advance every 20 seconds, back in 2011, I think they did. And the title was Why Zombies Love PCI. And in it, I kind of did something for a joke, to use a zombie apocalypse metaphor for why PCI wasn't going to work as is. And it's now the basis, the heart of a 6-hour module I do for Carnegie Mellon University's CISO graduate program. And I meant it as a joke, but I can recount it here in probably one breath of oxygen. There's it's a pyramid with 4 levels, and the bottom stuff matters the most, like the food guide pyramid, and the top stuff is the empty calories. And what I said is the key determinant in surviving the zombie apocalypse isn't what you do. It's the IT defensible infrastructure, the IT that you procure, you build, et cetera. It's if you're running through a field, do you see hordes of the undead wanting to eat your brains? Do you run towards the brick building or the dilapidated wooden barn? The IT we choose dictates if we have a fighting chance. The second most important layer of the pyramid isn't security stuff either. It's, do your fellow survivors act as a unit and calmly and methodically? It's the people process stuff. It's the IT operations. It's things like Gene Kim wrote about in, not in the Phoenix Project, but rather in Visible Ops for security when he worked on a project with CMU. And the third most important idea, if you have defensible infrastructure and it's well maintained and operated and people don't panic but act cohesively in a planful way, that's the things like, do I know what I have? Do I know when it changes? Do I tolerate 0 unplanned changes? Those are the top 3 findings of world-class IT. The third one starts to get into security. It's, do we have situational awareness? Do we have door sensors and floodlights and cameras to know, who's attacking us from which direction? Are they vampires or zombies or werewolves? So it's the eyes and ears to notice whispers and echoes. And we are very poorly instrumented in a lot of IT. So the kind of security that provides broad and pervasive visibility into what's going on both within your kingdom and in the broader industry, things like threat intelligence and community and information sharing. And then the last tippy top of the pyramid is the brittle countermeasures. It's If you're fighting zombies, you want, to go for the head. If you're fighting werewolves, you need, silver bullets. If you're fighting vampires, you need wooden stakes. So it's the specific brittle fit for purpose countermeasures should subordinate. And when I put them all together, security teams tend to have budget, influence, and authority and sphere of control over just the top two. So of course we hover there. And if you look at most of the PCI controls and a lot of the older regulatory controls, they're the specific brittle countermeasures, or maybe things like situational awareness was starting to creep in. But like the real gains are, do I have defensible IT that's well owned and operated, well instrumented, and then do I defend it with my finite resources in an economic way? Now, I don't think we went over that on our prep call, but when I say security is everyday responsibility, a lot of CISOs have shifted to informing and influencing IT procurement choices, merger and acquisition, building architecture choices with the CIO, with the CTO. One of the reasons I love DevOps is it's a boundary spanning function where they're in architecture, development, design, development, test, production, et cetera. And they talk more often with each other. So the sphere of control we've been isolated to on the top two pyramid levels, you start to have influence, a sphere of influence across the bottom two. And in my senior leadership positions, the most important things I did was change the way we produce software, shift them from waterfall to agile or agile to CI/CD. It's been baking in proper security wisdom at design level with threat modeling, et cetera. And I know this is not the DevOps and application security weekly talk, but I think you can fight bravely and die quickly if all you do is buy brittle security countermeasures at the top and you're ignorant to all the decisions the business is making at the bottom layers of the pyramid. While you don't own them, it's your job to positively influence them.
And therefore, a regulation like PCI that focuses on the top of the pyramid, the brittle controls and some situational awareness, are fragile because they're not reinforcing broader, deeper integration of security across the other parts of the pyramid, is what I think you just basically said.
They're necessary. In a well-balanced diet, they're necessary. They have to be subordinate to and contextualize within the bottom two layers for the real wins.
We need to determine whether this is a zombie pyramid or a food pyramid, because it's getting very confusing about the brains.
Zombies eat brains, right? So
it's a brain pyramid.
In all seriousness, what you're talking about is effectively risk management at an educated level. Risk management involves having all of this information and all of this instrumentation and all of this knowledge about yourself, about your environment, about everything around you, the people around you, the infrastructure around you, et cetera. And what you've done really is taken all of risk management and categorized it into this pyramid piece, which I like, by the way. It's very cool. Don't get me wrong. I'm not denigrating it in any way. And I think your opening point to that opening question, which I wanted to talk about really quickly, was fascinating. You said that security comes out of good IT based on this pyramid idea or something similar to it, forgive me. Whereas good compliance comes out of good risk management. And I would posit that actually is the same thing. Good risk management.
I think you're done it. Yeah.
Just pointing out that I think it's the exact same thing. Good risk management will give you good security and good compliance. It's a little abstract, yes, but it's still a very, very valid concept in my opinion. So that was really well done. I just wanted to point that out.
I think what I meant to say is in 2010, I wanted us to do good risk management, assuming the IT we inherited couldn't be influenced. And as I got further into this through the Phoenix Project, through CI/CD, through just more of the safety critical work I do through IM Cavalry, when you inherit an indefensible medical device, there's not a whole lot you can do after the fact, right? Your fate is sealed. Your dynamic range, to use a Dan Gearism, your dynamic range of defensive capability is fixed, and it's not very pretty. So the only nuance between my old 2010 statement and my newer one is that we have to positively influence design and deployment and operation considerations to have an even greater outcome. It's inclusive of my prior belief, but goes well beyond it.
Yeah, we took a very outside-in approach to security and compliance in the old days, Josh, right? I mean, infrastructure was what it was. We didn't have any influence, or not a lot of influence on it in the early days. We kind of tried to bolt stuff on from the outside. And we still face that, but things like DevOps and the CI/CD pipeline provide opportunities to embed security into the creation of the thing, the infrastructure, the app. When we talk second segment, we'll talk industrial IoT and medical devices, some other stuff, right? If you influence the infrastructure from the beginning, you have a greater opportunity to protect it from within than relying on a bunch of external security capabilities that are brittle and fragile, potentially, to secure that infrastructure. I think that's kind of your focus.
We had a friend who was the CISO of a Fortune 50 company, and he said, I spend 90%, and this was around 2008 timeframe. This is when I first coined PCI as the devil, and then Chris Hoff tweeted it, and then I had to get on Twitter to see how much I was ruining my career. So blame Chris Hoff. May of 2009, we were at an IONS event in New York City, and we were talking about game-changing security and all these great things we could do with virtualization and containers, and they weren't calling them containers back then, but we were thinking all these amazing things we could do. And then someone at the back of the room after 2 days said, yeah, but PCI makes me do all those old things. And I emoted PCI as the devil, and that started this whole process. But part of the reason I bring this stuff up is those controls were never the wrong idea. They were a reaction to a whole lot of failure, where a whole lot of people were doing nothing, and a belief that doing something is better than doing nothing. And we came up with stuff. My visceral innate concern of it, though, was that I saw people doing better than PCI, a couple of people, not everybody, right? A minority doing real risk management. And as soon as the economic downturn happened, there was, CIOs were basically saying you can spend your compliance mandated spending and not a penny more. So the good stuff got shelved, and the old stuff, the rearview mirror stuff, was the only thing we could spend on. And we kind of made this Faustian pact where, we channeled everything through a compliance mandate instead of doing the work to make a good risk management decision.
So that begs the question, Mr. Corman, Josh, where I've seen PCI, quote unquote, be successful is that it has driven many companies that were my customers over the years to do more with security than they already would have. To sort of build on your pyramid analogy, where you put PCI, fine. PCI is or has been used as a motivator where it really shouldn't have. But that notwithstanding, the few companies that you saw doing better than PCI back then, or bring it up to today, what is or can or should be the motivation for companies, or more basically, how do you get companies to care about security or risk management outside of being dragged to it by PCI or some other compliance or regulatory requirement?
Well, I'll try to answer that. It's going to be,
you'll be the first if you do, but go ahead.
But I mean, the reason I was talking about 2009 is one of the 50 people, top 50 CSOs said 90% of my time and energy for my entire team is collecting log files to show the QSA. Like, they were doing manual log file collection, right? This is before log file management got better. And that's why I knew this was just wrong. This is not the way to use talent. This is not the way to use security people. And one of the reasons, in contrast, I love things like CI/CD and DevOps is with orchestration automation. Like, if compliance requirements are coming, you can have evidence, captured evidence as a byproduct of your orchestration automation layers. Like, you have a change audit log of everything that happened. You can instrument stuff and throw it all to the right places and groom it in a way that each of the 1 through N regulatory auditors need. So that's not your question. I think part of the issue is, if you have to do, I'm going to reframe it slightly. If you have to do mandatory compliance for PCI or Sarbanes-Oxley or GLBA or whatever regime is coming next, there's a lot of them. When I was at Akamai, I think we had 20 different regulatory regimes. We had one risk management program we had to translate into proof of 20 different customer and regulatory audit regimes. So one to many. You've done it wrong when your time is spent proving you're doing a bad job. You're doing it right when you're doing good things and you have evidence for what you're doing that makes the auditor happy, right?
And
it was supposed to define a minimum. We ended up getting the finish line instead of the starting line. So how do you make them care? It's hard to make anybody care about anything they don't care about, but in their job that they're paid to do, it can be more effective. Generally, human beings want to be effective. They want to do a good job, and just collecting log stuff isn't necessarily fun or challenging. And I know that compliance involves more than collecting logs and just latching onto it because it was so visceral when that top Fortune 50 CISO said, all we do is collect log files and show it to the auditor. What is he not doing? What is his team not doing when they're doing that? So what I've seen, though, is people want to be effective at protecting the interests of their company. They want to align to the business without it being a cliche. And some of the ways they can do that is look for effective and free ways to get the evidence and things. One of the projects I challenged that group to do back in 2009 was maybe it's not about securing a dangerous piece of IT. Maybe it's about eliminating it. Complexity is the enemy of security, elective attack surface. Do we really need all those servers, or can we maybe retire some? So I asked, in fact, I think this quote made the Phoenix Project, but I said, sometimes it's not about what you put into the system that measures your success as a security person, but maybe what you take out of the system. And legacy stuff is often the low-hanging fruit for pen testers. And I don't have to tell you guys that, but sometimes it's the IT you forgot you had or you wish you didn't have that can be a toehold for adversaries. So I think making them care about it isn't maybe the right way, because people are rarely going to care about you. I think instead, it's what I do, and what I teach my students in the class is each of your executives in the organization and each of your IT teammates, they have their own motivational structure, and they have their own way that they get bonused and incentivized. And if you can meet them through their incentive and find a win-win that can drive your goals and their goals, then they're not carrying your water. They're doing things in a way that meets their needs and your needs. So, instead of being an adversary of the business, no one likes fighting with their teammates or fighting for budget. But if you can find a way to say, hey, this new project that we were going to do this way, if we did it this way instead, with containers and microservices, not only would it be higher availability for you and your bonus, but it might also be better instrumented and more defensible and more auditable for my purposes in AppSec. So I don't think there's a single motivation to make them care about security. I don't think many of them will ever care about security, but what they do care about is how their bonus is incentivized. And the jujitsu, I find, is finding a way to map their incentives to yours.
It's mapping the security components into their business components that they're getting compensated on. And I think that's a very important point, Josh, is that, look, at the end of the day, unless there's a business driver for it, it's going to be really hard to justify aspects of this, right? And so if you can find those business motivators that allow you to also get security along the way, you can get adoption that way.
Sometimes it just security sucks, but we had not historically been creative enough to find the win-wins, and there's plenty of them.
Right. So everything that you've been speaking about, and thank you for coming on the show, by the way, everything you've been speaking about has been, unfortunately, doom or gloom, right? Doom and gloom, doom or gloom, however you want to phrase it. Let's talk about the good, right? What did the CISO that you were talking with, and you've spoken about him a couple of times here, what was he doing good that got him to the point where he was able to collect the logs and he had that rapport with the assessor, right? Can you talk about that?
I mean, I think in general, it's a good idea to have good instrumentation and know what's going on in your environment. So he found the silver lining for certain, but he bought products, right? A bunch of tactical products, a bunch of spike and boom and log management and SIM products.
Point solutions.
No, but the good, yes. And the good ones turned it into strategic value when they could.
Well, right. But I'm asking about him specifically, right? What was his main driver to get him to the point where he can sit back and say, okay, here's a collection of log files. Are you good with this? Because you already know what we're doing. What was he doing? Like, what was the prescription coming down from him? Or let's take it in a more broader sense, right? Of the companies that you've seen doing this correctly, what are the key hallmarks that have pointed to or indicators of doing that action correctly?
Okay. So there's a number of ways I could take this. You reminded me of one, though, that was a key criticism of PCI, which was this particular Fortune 50, their most important asset to the livelihood of that organization was not regulated card data, but 100% of his budget was on the asset subtype of regulated card data and the card data environment. So it was, instead of protecting intellectual property, trade secrets, sensitive organizational data. And they were a target of nation state adversaries, and they were getting hit by nation state adversaries. So part of his program should have been a balanced and proportional focus on the assets that might have put the company out of business, or might have hurt its economic future, or might have protected life and limb. But the only one that had teeth, the only regulatory regime at the time in 2009, 2010 that had teeth, it wasn't even privacy stuff. It was just card data. So it was driving maybe good patterns of activity, maybe ineffective, brittle specific controls, but at a subset of the data, which in his total risk register or total board level concern, the reason we cared about it is because the PCI regime made us care about it. Had it not been for that, they may have put more focus on trade secrets, intellectual property, and the like.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, Corman, Josh, because I'm hearing you say that the guy sucked at his job because he couldn't convince the executives that there was more to worry about than PCI. He couldn't shake them from the however they got the perception that PCI is the only thing that they need to respond to. To me, that's not a success story.
I'll have you take it up with him if you want, or see if he'll engage you on if he sucked or not. But look, how do you get executives to care? I'm rephrasing my original question. How do you get them to care about things other than the compliance thing that's got everybody's attention? And or why didn't this guy capitalize on PCI and use that as a label and moniker to get everything he needed within his organization? That's what I would have done. All right, so without rehashing our whole prep and eating up the entire first segment, let's 30 I'm going to use my hands because I have Italian blood, so I'm going to use my hands to talk. I think within the intended scope of PCI, if the only asset you had to protect was card data in the card data environment, then I think even within that narrow asset type, if you're fortunate enough to that's your only attack surface and risk for your organization and for your stakeholders, then even within that silo, I felt that we were mostly focused on older, brittle, specific countermeasures and dabbling in countermeasures, situational awareness, the top two parts of the pyramid. So we could have been more effective even within that silo by looking at, maybe not securing a piece of plastic with a magnetic strip on it. So eventually we got more into the payment card infrastructure itself. But even within that silo, what I'm saying is for a lot of folks who had many assets in their kingdom they were responsible for, and they were doing a good job, I don't think the guy was a failure. I want to contextualize the economy and bridge it back to modern days, so we're not just talking about the past here. He was doing a little bit of everything across the asset kingdom. He was meeting his regulatory things. And then the 2008 economy tanked, and executives who were laying people off en masse, they're looking at everyone's going to tighten their belts. What can we tighten? Well, let's reduce everybody's maybe an intelligent thing would have been ask the risk management people how to protect our corporate interests in a way that's proportional to our, lack of staff and lack of money during an economic winter. But instead what happened was, okay, there's the stuff that we have to do for PCI and everything else is discretionary. And you'd be hard pressed to get much money. I did tell you the short version reminder of what story I told you offline was, most people realized one of the ways to reduce the pain of PCI was to consolidate and compress your card data environment and scope. I encountered some of these CISOs who deliberately ballooned their scope and put credit card data in R&D areas so they could actually get an intrusion detection device in an R&D building that otherwise would have been completely blind. So they very subversively exploded their PCI scope to be able to still get budget to do some level of risk management beyond card data.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Hold on.
They hacked PCI and they used PCI to get what they needed. That's brilliant.
That's creativity. That's not explosively exploding scope.
If you ask them what would you do if you could actually marshal resources to the most important stuff, it would have been different things. Some of them wanted to buy. I don't want to go back to 2010, but that whole 2-day thing that Chris Hoff and I ran in New York City, there were very useful newer technologies. People were embracing virtualization. Heck, one of the complaints about PCI is it took them like 6 years to actually mention virtualization and how to be compliant after these banks were already deploying it in production. So the auditors did not tell you if you were even compliant using VMware for like many years. So the slow nature of PCI was a different complaint. But people were doing good and creative things and had to kind of stop the good and creative things and do the required things. One of the analogies I used was the No Child Left Behind Act. The talk that I finally articulated myself better than just saying PCI is the devil was I compared PCI to the No Child Left Behind Act for education. And the idea, oversimplified, is there's a bell curve, and there's some people that are doing nothing, right? And there's some people that are doing a really great job, and there's a lot of people in the middle. And I think what PCI unquestionably did is it took people doing nothing and made them do something, right? And that something was like good. But the people that were doing better and best now had to go backwards to improve that they were doing the good. And sometimes that was instead of better and best. And then my secondary complaint after acknowledging that and getting a lot of acknowledgement from the PCI Council was, okay, fine. You defined a minimum. Now let's evolve and grow it with proportional to threats and technology. Like when VMware comes out, you should probably have guidance pretty quickly, not years later, but months later. And when there's new adversary techniques, you should adapt and update those controls that are the correct controls, and not the fighting the last war. And then what we got into is, people in the PCI community hate change. We can't change it. They'll revolt if we change it more. So initially, I thought it set a bar very low, but maybe that's okay in a crawl, walk, run kind of capacity. I use that a lot. But it never started to walk and run. It just kind of created a minimum. We got a minimum, and it wasn't keeping pace. The rate of change and evolution of that standard and regime was pretty slow.
Right, but going back to what you were saying about answering Jeff's how do you fix this, right? Shouldn't that have already been in the goals, according to what you said, right? They should have already had that encapsulated in the goals of you have to advance security X amount.
Well, I think we're going to get into this in the second segment, but what I realized is I don't hate all regulation. What I realized is control objectives are good. Right? Measuring outcomes are good. Saying specifically how to do it in a very brittle and old way is bad. And the people that were trying to do new things, I mean, I don't want to speak for Andy Ellis at Akamai, but he used to like to toy with some of the QSAs that would come in and he'd say, you guys aren't using proper passwords. And he's like, I know. I'm not using any. I'm using certificates. I'm doing something superior. And he loved to toy with the QSA, asking for the letter of the law specific thing. If you got someone as good as Jeff, then Jeff would both want you to meet and exceed and would encourage alternative compensating controls, sometimes superior controls to the letter of the law. A lot of the QSAs, especially since some of them were kind of turned into a puppy mill and a race to the bottom, they wanted you to do exactly what you're supposed to do, even if it was inferior to what you were doing. And a lot of back and forth through the report on compliance on negotiating why what you were doing was better. And that takes a lot of work when instead you want to be negotiating with your CIO on how to make the future, cloud infrastructure safer than the on-prem brick and mortar infrastructure. So it's just
that's an old version of PCI. Sorry, I didn't mean to break in, Josh.
It has changed since then.
Yeah, significantly. And I just wanted to point that out. That this is an old version you're talking about. This is much ago. You're not talking about current versions. You're talking about what was, not what is. Just wanted to point that out.
And one of the hacks I tried to give them, and Jeff said they're almost to the finish line on it finally. But when I came up with HD Moore's Law, that was a twist on Moore's Law. I said basically, after many, many fights with PCI Council, all the way up to Troy and Bob at the time at the PCI meeting in Florida, I said, one way you could fix a lot of this is you say you need a pen test, but it's often a Nessus scan, and without much scrutiny. You could fix this by saying you need to be able to notice and respond to anything in the current catalog of Metasploit project. Because what HD Moore's Law was, well, I'll pause that for a sec. What I meant was PCI was an untested hypothesis. Let's add a feedback loop. Like if these controls you think should stop most things, then let's make this more outcomes based. Define what counts as a minimum pen test or frequency. or a minimum passing grade, besides the fact that you have these controls, do they actually work? And later on, what they said in that meeting was, Josh, you're right. A lot of these things won't stop a determined adversary, but they'll stop a casual adversary. And they felt comfortable saying someone who wants to get you is going to get you, even if you passed your audit. But it'll stop a casual adversary. And after DEF CON 1 year, I went straight to MetroCon for Alex Hutton in San Francisco. And I saw a bunch of data science people talking data science and rates of change. And I completely rewrote my talk at the last second to introduce H.D. Moore's law. And I said, you know what? The strength of a casual adversary isn't a static thing. It's not like if I pass my audit, I'm going to stop somebody, because they get better every day. So I said the strength of an unskilled adversary grows at the rate of the Metasploit project. And if you can't stop Metasploit, you can't stop anybody. And that kind of became the new way to tell if I pass my PCI audit, but I can't even notice a handful of randomly picked things in the free attack frameworks, whether it's Kali Linux or Metasploit, or pick your favorite one, then is this really working at all? And by adding that feedback loop, what I was trying to do is if they could tie the hypothesis of PCI to a continuous evaluation of outcomes, they would salvage most of those control types, because people would be focused on how well does it work, not do I have them, but how well does it work? And
I'm going to call
that to heart. And it sounds like from what you said, Jeff, they mostly got there by bridging and finally fleshing out and defining something more than an ESSA scan.
Well, they're getting there. And I was going to call party foul very quickly and just point out you've referred to it as the PCI audit. It's technically not an audit, it's an assessment, but the whole world thinks of it as an audit, which is one of the reflections of what's wrong with PCI that I would concede. When you were looking at PCI, I would have accepted an Nmap result, frankly, as an assessor, right, the way pen testing was defined at the time. But now they have built into the standard, one of the requirements is you have a documented penetration testing methodology that looks at things inside and out, network level, application level, and do it periodically or after significant changes. What I think is wrong with PCI is the way it gets misapplied. Not what's there, but the way it gets misapplied by people trying to reduce it to a bare minimum, make it a checkbox. But also it's built into it is there's an assumption that somewhere in the ecosystem, there's an expert that's helping you make the right choice and understand the nuance and what's built into PCI. And very often that's the QSA, the Qualified Security Assessor. And I realized more and more, not every QSA out there started at NSA, started the first NSA red team, had 20 years of InfoSec experience before becoming a QSA. I was maybe perhaps a tad overqualified. And I'm not singling myself out, just to say that there's a lot of mileage in terms of the quality of QSA, and even if they understand their role. But we have run long. We need to take a quick break. We will be back shortly, and we're going to try to shift gears a little bit and talk about the good that can be used in terms of regulatory and compliance. And we'll talk a little bit about the things that the Corman Josh has been doing lately. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.